what happened in the last 19 months is a huge blow to an already crumbling building. And the building, in this case, is international law. What is worrying in a way, that obvious, natural human reaction to that inhumanity is not affecting the political, cultural, and media elites of the West. This gap will get wider and wider, and no lobbying in the world will be able to stop it. You can call it implosion from within, that could very easily lead to a civil war. But that's within the Jewish society. We have a lot of rulers in the Arab world. We don't have many leaders. To build something that is far more connected to the past, to the heritage of the place, and is not trying to reflect a European state model that was imposed by the colonialist powers. If the Israeli army needs 1,000 soldiers and 100 armored vehicles to capture few Palestinian teenagers, this is not an invincible army.
Welcome to the Narrative House podcast. I'm your host, Abdullah Al-Andalusi. After 19 months of genocide in Gaza and 77 years since the Nakba and over 100 years of colonial occupation, we are standing at a critical time for Palestine, the Middle East, and indeed the global world order as we know it. Is this the beginning of the end of the State of Israel? Is this the start of something new for Palestine and the Middle East? Can what existed before the State of Israel exist again? Today, I am honored to be joined by Professor Ilan Pappé, historian, prolific writer, lecturer, and truth-teller, and one of the most courageous critics of Zionism and settler colonialism, writing many works such as The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine and 10 Myths about Israel. Professor Pappé has exposed the foundational violence of the Israeli state and challenged dominant historical narratives. Professor Pappé, thank you for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Abdallah, and thank you for having me.
So I'll go straight into it. You have written extensively about the Zionist lobbying of Western politicians. Opinions remain divided. Some argue US policy towards Israel reflects America's own strategic geopolitical interests in the region, securing resources, sometimes weaponizing even Islamophobia at their behest at a political level. Others argue that Israeli influence distorts US policy, embroiling the US in unnecessary wars, as the policy analyst Jeffrey Sachs recently argued, with, as it were, the tail wagging the dog, some might say. Where do you stand on this debate?
I think it's both explanations are valid and are not necessarily mutually exclusive, as people would like to think. Namely, American interest involves a very ruthless intervention in what goes on in the Arab world or the Muslim world, and not only in the global South. We remember the American imperialist intervention in the Philippines, in Southeast Asia, in Africa, not to mention, of course, Central America and South America. So in a way, an American policy that targets the Arab world in general, or one nation in the Arab world, like the Palestinians, in a way does not need an advocacy group or a lobby group to orientate it towards this direction. However, it would be too simplistic to look at American policy as one-dimensional. It is made of different, I would say, impulses. And some of the impulses, some of the motives behind that policy can be more positive than negative. And we should never take a determinist view of any policy, including the American policy. And I think where if you want, the tail wags the dog here, namely that the lobby is very crucial, is to make sure that the alternative voices that could have changed American policy, either in general towards the global South, or in particular, in the case of the Palestinians, would not materialize. And that's where the lobby is so important. So kind of killing in its bud any individual, organization, or thought that might lead to a different American policy, either for genuine reasons, which would be moral reasons, or for even more practical, cynical reasons, but one that at the end of the day might at least benefit the Palestinians or other people that suffer from American allies who get the shield of immunity, provided with a shield of immunity in the name of serving American national interest.
Well, we recently saw ultra-right wing Itamar Ben-Gvir with President Trump glorifying the breaking of international norms and laws. Many have been saying the damage done to international norms and laws has been seismic. With support from European nations and USA, Israel has been tearing up the global rules-based order, according to many. Is this the West destroying its legacy through the influence of the Zionist lobby? Or is this just another expose of the West's well-established, over 100-year relationship with the Middle East?
I would offer you a different metaphor. I think what happened in the last 19 months is a huge blow to an already crumbling building, a building that already had extensive cracks in its foundation. And the building, in this case, is international law or the international legal system. So I don't think that what happened in the last 19 months, or particularly the American policy towards Israel or towards the Arab world, is the main reason for the collapse or the deep crisis. If we want to be a bit more careful, we'll call it the deep crisis in which international legal systems and the very concept of international law is undergoing. It is just probably one of the most important proofs that a lot of people needed to the fact that international law is not international, that it's not based on universal values. And that allows people to go back to the very origin of what we call international law, which is a set of ideas and principles that the West created after the Second World War, while many parts of the world were still colonized by the West, and were based on a certain ideas that were very European and Western, but without any consultation with other people, actually without challenging even colonialism at the time. So not surprisingly, there comes a moment when you can see more clearly the deficiencies of that system. People already knew it probably before the last 19 months, that this system is used towards those that the global West doesn't like, and very rarely is used internally towards Western societies or regimes that actually violate international law. If that system had a moment in which it could shine through and at least prove to all of us that we were wrong, that it's still a universal, was the case of Israel in the last 19 months. I think it should have been done before 19 months, but let's say the last 19 months were too evident and too obvious, and it totally failed in doing that. And I think that failure is far more profound than any other failures in the past to convince people that we're talking here about a universal system of values. We're not. The crisis is deep and very worrying in a way, because without such international system, the world as a global community will not be able to deal with global challenges, which you cannot deal with one country, like global warming, poverty, immigration. On the other hand, like every time we encounter it in history, a collapse of one system opens the way for renegotiating something better. So we are in that very precarious moment in history, I think.
In your opinion, what impact has this had on the world's view of the Israeli state? How has it impacted not just Jewish people worldwide in diaspora, but also world public opinion amongst the masses, especially since many people, including lawyers, have now been calling Israel a pariah state, where before they might have been more reticent to do so?
Absolutely. I think that tragically, the carnage is so visible and on such a magnitude that it does not allow anyone with a modicum of decency in them to turn their eyes away from what's happening and not to condemn it. And that's why, like never before, since in the history of modern Palestine, so many millions of people show their solidarity with the Palestinians and condemn Israel for what it is doing. And that is definitely has to do both with the level of brutality and its visibility. What is worrying in a way, that obvious, natural human reaction to that inhumanity is not affecting the political, cultural, and media elites of the West. That's very worrying. People say, well, it's understandable. I say, no, it's not. I mean, I'm not naive. I know politics can be a very cynical business. So I can understand why Western politicians were not particularly interested in Palestine in 1948. After all, there was no television, there was no internet, and this was 3 years after so many people were dislocated because of the Second World War. I'm not justifying it, but I say that's more, you can explain it. Even after the creation of the State of Israel, and even after the occupation of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in 1967, you can understand that the way Israel oppressed the Palestinians was incremental. It was not dramatic. And that allowed politicians, journalists, and intellectuals to say, well, it's not so bad, because they decided to ignore the cumulative effect, and talking about the possibilities of peace around the corner and so on. All these assumptions that immunize people from taking strong moral positions toward Israel disappeared in the last 19 months. And that is what's so surprising, that now they are not only facing Israel, they are also facing their own societies in a way that questions their morality and legitimacy, not only on the question of Palestine, but on many other questions that probably concern their own societies, wherever they are.
Do you think this has created any tensions amongst pro-Israel, previous staunch Zionist supporters of Israel? Like, for example, recently we saw in the UK, 30 members from the British Board of Deputies wrote a letter to the Financial Times complaining and criticizing the state of Israel for what it's doing in Gaza, saying that they can't turn away from what they're seeing and that the Jewish values compels them to speak out. And then a week later, we see many of them were put under disciplinary action by their fellow colleagues in the Board of Deputies, which is, for context, they're one of the oldest Jewish organizations in the UK. So how much do you think what Israel's done has caused tension amongst its previous staunchest supporters?
Well, of course, this is doubly humiliating, or not humiliating, this is doubly offensive. I mean, the fact that it took them so long, these 13 people, I don't want to underrate their courage in a way, but it's a bit too late and too little. And then it's even more offensive that they are being treated as criminals because of something natural that they did. But far more important is your general question about it. What the Zionist lobby was able to do is to draw a map of the Jewish communities in the world, which distinguished between institutions and congregations. And not only congregation, generally a Jewish identity that could stretch between people who would define themselves as secular Jews to people who would be very Orthodox Jews, as they would call them, even ultra-Orthodox Jews, namely very pious, very, very careful with adhering to the religion precepts as they understand them. Now, what the Zionist lobby succeeded in doing is to make sure that the institutions are becoming like embassies for Israel. And therefore, the institution, and that's very much like AIPAC, like the pro-Israeli lobby, don't have their own ideas of what should be done, because they do function like embassies, and they follow whatever is the main line that Israel follows at a given time. So I wouldn't expect that they feel any predicament, the institutions themselves. However, the congregations, Jewish population in general, especially the young generation of Jews, whether in Britain or elsewhere, know too much to be able to continue to follow their institutional guidance, this institutional guidance. And there is a gap that I predict will become deeper and deeper between institutions that claim that they represent Jewish communities wherever they are, especially including in Britain, and what most of people who define themselves as Jews feel about the question of Israel. And this gap will get wider and wider, and no lobbying in the world will be able to stop it. And that's a very positive development, because lack of legitimacy from Jewish communities around the world to the project of Zionism is a very important process, among other processes, that can lead for a much better future for the people who live in modern Palestine and those who were expelled from there.
Mm. Well, indeed, Steve Bannon, the former advisor to Donald Trump, said recently the biggest threat to the state of Israel is not all these boogeymen that they've been portraying, but actually he said it's Jews in the United States and in the West who are waking up to its reality. He didn't use that term, but he just said it was them. They are the worst. They're the biggest threat.
Yeah.
Okay, I'd like to shift focus a little bit to, I suppose, more the Middle East and the perception of the state of Israel in the Middle East and the local regimes and the people and the reaction to, or the lack of reaction or inaction of the states, Arab states, to what Israel is doing. Some people say Israel relies heavily on certain myths for its existence, the myth of invincibility being one of them. Around the war with its Arab neighbors, especially in 1967, there was a portrayal in the West of this David versus Goliath battle. You've shown in your book, The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, that this is utterly false. You show that, for example, the Jordanian troops only agreed to fight for the West Bank, which had been agreed to be part of Jordan. The Arab armies were not a formidable force, as was said. They used some used antiquated equipment, dysfunctional supply lines, equipment that they didn't even know how to use in some cases, and their suppliers were Britain and France, who were the very colonial entities supporting the settler colonial state of Israel. So the weak response by the Arab states, in fact, in a sense, legitimized the state of Israel. However, this myth of invincibility, which was created, is critical for the existence of the state of Israel by inducing inaction or discouraging hope. Until October 7th, it was portrayed that Israel was the only democracy in the region, an economic powerhouse, the most moral army in the world, with a unified population. Some of these have been completely broken, while there are cracks in others, some might say. How has the ongoing genocide impacted these myths? Zionists like Ehud Barak, Ehud Olmert, and Ahanad Barak are warning of civil war. What are the internal cracks that are rising in the surface of Israeli society? How are these factors taking their toll on Israel internally, especially after some people have said the poor performance of reservists in the army vis-a-vis some of the enemies, which are not established armies but militia groups in essence?
Well, there are certain internal dynamics that expose the weakness that you are talking about, and they are very profound. And probably some of them started before the 7th of October, but whatever happened on the 7th of October accelerated these dynamics, made them much more potent. One of that dynamics is the inability to create a cohesive idea of what does it mean to be a Jewish nation. And that has very little to do with the Palestinians. There's something inherently impossible in the idea of turning a religion into nationality. I mean, the wish of the Zionist movement to redefine Judaism as nationalism would not have been didn't work, and it would not have worked even if the Jews of Europe would have chosen an empty island in the middle of the ocean. It doesn't work because it's a faith, it's a religion, and it does not create the basis for a national affinity. And the clash between those who see themselves as, let's call them secular Jews, and those who think that Judaism is religion and therefore being a Jewish state has to be one that adheres to Jewish theology, if you want. This is now has come to the fore in the battle about how the public arena or sphere should look like. But more than that, there is a sense that there is such a disagreement between these two sides of the divide that even an external enemy is not enough to create a cement that keeps it together. And the reason is that both sides have taken a very extreme point of view of what should the vision of the state be. The secular think about a totally kind of European, even a West European liberal democracy, be it at the same time an apartheid state as far as the Palestinians are concerned. And the other ones take a very messianic, quite extreme point of view of Judaism that includes a very profound element of racism, I would say even genocidal racism towards the Palestinians as human beings. And these two perceptions are not working, and for the first time I think people realize they're not working on a daily basis. This is not a debate between intellectuals. This is a debate between two ways of life that it was hoped that a settler colonial project would create the affinity, but it's such a negative impulse, such a negative idea. We can be together because we are alienated by the area, or we are alienating the area. It turns out that it's not enough to create that kind of idea. So that's one internal process. You can call it implosion from within that could very easily lead to a civil war. But that's within the Jewish society. What also is important is that the more secular, the more liberal, however you want to call it, is populating the elites in a very dominant way. And these elites have something interesting that the others don't have. They have dual nationalities, and they have jobs that they can reignite outside. So we have this massive immigration in the last 19 months. We don't know the numbers because the Israelis hide it, but it's a huge number of people who consist the economic, I would say even the military and cultural elite of Israel that are trying to live elsewhere in a different context. The other process that you are alluded to, and rightly so, is the invincibility or the lack of invincibility of the army. The 7th of October exposed something some of us knew already before the 7th of October. If the Israeli army needs 1,000 soldiers and 100 armored vehicles to capture few Palestinian teenagers in the Jenin refugee camp, this is not an invincible army. This army has become a policing force in the last 57 years. So it's not so surprising that when he was faced with a military group in the Gaza Strip that had no air force, nor artillery, it did not even until today succeeded to totally defeat it. Not to mention the fact that the Israelis have this image, what would have happened if Hezbollah would have coordinated a similar attack in the north? How would Israel look after such a twin assault? So there is a sense that the army is not that invisible by the Jewish society itself. So it's lack of confidence of the army to defend. But there's something else which is very important. For at least half, I think, of the Israelis, and this was time to sink in, and that gives me hope. The only message they get from the army, and not only from the army, it's political elite, that Israel would always have to live on the sword and would always have to win. That's the message. Will it always win? I mean, even from a practical perspective, you nearly lost to a small group of guerrilla fighters. So how can you tell us that this is what we should expect in the next 50 years? So that's another dynamics that is very important. To this, you should add a huge economic crisis. Israel is totally dependent now on American economic aid. The $12 billion that Biden gave them has disappeared already. Again, a sign of hope, because whatever we think about Donald Trump, he does check the current account of the United States all the time.
A businessman through and through.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay.
And if he would be asked to give double the amount, which is what Israel needs. Israel needs now $40 billion. If he would be asked to give Israel $40 billion, regardless of what we think about Trump, he's not very likely to go that way. He's not very likely to go that way. It's important to remember that. Again, without any positive idea. Finally, you have to add two processes which are very important for this. One, we already mentioned, and I won't repeat it, just mention it as in a soundbite, the change in the Jewish perception of Israel. We talked about it, which is part of the international isolation of Israel, and we talked about it. And let's not forget the Palestinians. They are disunited politically, they are fragmented. The national movement is not in a good moment in its history, and it's a pity because there is a huge historical opportunity to be exhausted here. But it's a very young society, and it has shown unbelievable resilience and resistance. And therefore, I think its existence and its possibilities of being much more organized and representative in the future is another process we should pay attention to in creating this infusion that might create conducive circumstances for building something different between the river and the sea in Palestine.
I mean, this brings up the question as to what do you see the future being as a single state, a two-state solution? We have seen previous examples. South Africa, they got rid of the apartheid. No one had to leave. Some did and became car tycoons in America, whether good or bad. But in Algeria, the offer was offered to the French settlers. They could stay and become citizens. Most decided to leave, didn't want to stay. What do you see is the likelihood, and what would you like to see?
Yeah. First of all, of course, one thing we have to change, all of us, I think, that who dealt with the issue, is to let the Palestinians be the drivers of the vision, because so much of the failure of the so-called peace process was that the Palestinians always had to react to other people's ideas about the future. And one thing the Palestinians are not doing enough is thinking what they can offer the Jews in a liberated, decolonized Palestine. They think it's not important. I think it is very important. It's part of what they should think about it. In that context, I'm a great believer that the past teaches us about future models much more than what we usually do in Western diplomacy, which is to look for Western models like the Westphalian nation state as something that can inspire us to think about a solution, hence the two-state solution. That at best, let's have the Palestinian have a nation state next to the Israeli nation state, which of course is an invalid idea morally, but also as has been seen recently, very impractical, and it's not going to work. No, there is a way of creating joint life, which is not only a one-state solution. You cannot, in my mind, you cannot disassociate the nation-state system that was built by the colonial powers after the First World War from the situation in Palestine. In fact, it's a very Zionist notion that Israel and Palestine are not connected to the Eastern Mediterranean, what we call in Arabic the Mashriq. That whatever happens in Syria and Jordan, Lebanon, is not relevant to what's happening in Israel and Palestine, because that's part of Europe. That's a European issue, which of course is a false assumption. So in many ways, the disintegration of Syria, a process which nobody should be able to predict, I hope, and not dare to predict exactly how it will unfold, because of too many factors. We have to wait a bit patiently to see where it's going. But nobody can doubt that what happened in Syria, among other things, is the beginning of the collapse of the political structure built in the whole Eastern Mediterranean. And Palestine is part of it. So for me, it's not just a matter of one state, of course, which I do believe in, where people should be equal between the river and the sea, based also on the right of return for the refugees, transitional justice. But I think it would be part of a much more profound historical process, where people would have to think about political system that reflects the mosaic of identities that you have in the Eastern Mediterranean, the connection to Islamic civilization, the connection to the global South, all kinds of things that both European colonialism and Zionism actually robbed the area from relying on. Now, I have no idea exactly how it will be done. I don't believe you can reenact history as if nothing has changed in the last 200 years. But some of the models that even the late Ottomans respected, a genuine live and let live between communities within an empire, are, of course, not exactly the same. But some of that genuine coexistence has to be recreated. And in that respect, and it would be very painful for the Jews of Israel, but I think they would have to realize that the only way that they can be hoping to live in peace is to be part of that mosaic rather than being outside of that mosaic. So the Jewish identity can be an ethnocultural identity. You know, we have many ethnocultural groups in the Eastern Mediterranean. Hebrew culture can be respected, no worries. The language is not an enemy of anyone. And all of that can create the kind of, without beautifying it, without, kind of romanticizing it, but it's far more reflective of people's actual life on the ground, Have a reference group. If you want, you don't want a reference group, so you go to the big city, so you're without reference group, but it's far more flexible group identities and individual identities within a certain culture and civilization. And yes, maybe as a European Jew, some people will not like it. As you said, some whites in South Africa didn't like to live in a post-apartheid South Africa. That is not a good enough reason not to build something that is far more connected to the past, to the heritage of the place, and is not trying to reflect a European state model that was imposed by the colonialist power. So it's in it, I can see a state based on equality. But if this process would be only internally between the river and the sea, it would not be sustainable unless it is connected to the more regional, especially the Eastern Mediterranean, being able to go back to a political system that ensures that what we see today in Eastern Mediterranean, millions of hungry people, millions of angry people, their basic needs are being satisfied, and that the kind of life that they used to have can be reignited, which was mostly peaceful and mostly concerned in a normal human, interests and basic ideas, and not something that would lead to more bloodshed and carnage.
I think that this touches upon something quite interesting, which you said. You talked about historical examples, historical heritage, and past practices, past good practices, you might say. So David Ben-Gurion is not well known by most people, but I'm sure you're very well aware. He wrote in, I think, in 1920s, he was, for most people who don't know this, he didn't know if a Jewish state could emerge while the Arabs are the majority, and if the British give independence too soon, he was thinking, well, maybe we could use the Ottoman Millah system of autonomous communities. They have their own law system, in cases even their own police force for their own affairs. There's no boundaries or borders. There's just autonomy. And this was due to the Islamic system of having, I sometimes describe as a federation of faith communities, as opposed to a federation of territories, because there was no delineated territory. And of course, Theodor Herzl, the successful leader of political Zionism, actually praised Sultan Abdul Hamid and the Ottomans for the treatment of Jews compared to Europe. And you mentioned then that it's very Zionist to refer to nation-state models, because of course Zionism is itself a nation-state model. So would you say then that in a sense the Arabs and others in the Middle East adhering to the nation-state model that was imposed upon them and they adopted by the British and the French is in a sense reinforcing the worldview of Zionism, that nation-state model is the only possible solution, and therefore there can be a zero-sum game. It's either your nation-state model or my nation-state, but it must be a nation-state model. So do you think that the real way to defeat the excesses that we see that is committed by Israeli state and Zionism and so on is to throw away this nation-state model and start with every other country in the Middle East as well? Include not just say we'll only look at Israel for that's the only area we want to see change, but rather we look broadly and say we need to see change everywhere else in the Middle East, and to go back to not exactly the time machine, but to go back to what was there beforehand, what worked beforehand.
There's two caveats. First of all, you never really destroy something totally that existed, and I don't think you can destroy totally the idea that people in Lebanon feel that they are Lebanese, and quite a lot of people in Syria feel that they are Syrians, and Iraqi feel that they're Iraqis. So I think the process in history is a bit more complex than that. You don't sort of put an end to one political system or structure and you create something totally new. That Marxists used to think that way, that you can do this, and it doesn't. No, it's a far more dialectical process. I'll explain what I mean by dialectical. It's you don't destroy everything that was built in the last 70 years, but you make sure that it is infused with new ideas that probably, and I believe incrementally rather than in a revolutionary way, would weaken the nation state in a positive way. Will it totally disappear? I don't know, but it would weaken this idea and would give space again to the mosaic of identities, to the more general perception of what unites people, whether they live in Deir ez-Zor or they live in Rabat in Morocco. That kind of process is never a recreation. You don't repeat history. You don't reenact what happened in the past. But the past, unlike what modernization theories tell us, is not an obstacle for a better future. It's a positive injunction into the discussion. How exactly it will happen is very dynamic, and I'm not sure it will happen the same way everywhere. But what I'm saying is that there is a process of disintegration that needs to be accompanied by ideas of what should replace it. Otherwise, disintegration can continue even if you don't have a good idea what should replace it. then it becomes chaos, then it becomes carnage. That's why I think we should pay attention and think about it, and definitely consider what you said, and not just think that the only supermarket for good ideas is in the West. So that's the first caveat. The second thing, which is very important, is to understand that that most people, let's put it this way, most people are not going to be involved in an intensive way in politics. Are not going to be intensely involved, leaving aside the daily hardship, the daily concerns. And one of the interesting things that happened in the Arab world is the crisis of leadership. I mean, we have a lot of rulers in the Arab world. We don't have many leaders. And the young generation that was very much critical, and rightly so, on rulers, not only on persons, but on the systems themselves, including the nation state, including certain regimes, did not go as far as saying, but we are willing to be part of the new politics. But you need structures. You need structures. And that's why I think that this is something to be aware of, that you cannot, it doesn't happen by itself. And if you want to be part of it, sometimes you even have to aspire to be part of a leadership or part of the group that guides it together, or ties it together and makes it a powerful force. And therefore, I think that it's an incremental dynamics that would succeed if the young people of today would also take upon themselves positions of leadership and not just critical. But definitely it is a model that should have reflects the heritage, the history, as well as the new current realities. And that's why it will never be exactly like it was, because reality is important as well. I mean, will adapt to some of the developments that were not there before the modern era began.
So, kind of moving away from the existing structures that we looked at in the Middle East to those who occupy the positions of power within these structures, mainly a lot of the Middle Eastern, the Arab regimes, right. Turkey and many others. You probably no doubt have heard a phrase amongst many people, Arabs and others, who have called their own regimes the real Iron Dome, especially Egypt and Jordan, who allow the use of their airspace to defend Israel, who create land bridges to supply Israel with goods and things when after the Houthis disrupted trade in the south. Many people have realized and noticed that the Rafah border crossing was closed many times, and for a lot of the time, well before October the 7th, due to an agreement between Israel and the Egyptian regime. And sometimes many Zionists argue, we never blocked the Rafah border for all those years in the blockade, so why are you only blaming us? How dependent is Israel on its Arab and Muslim neighbors and their cooperation with USA and Europe, including also Turkey and its allowing oil and gas supplies to go to Israel, despite what it's doing? So how much do you think Israel is facilitating what it's doing by this cooperation of sorts from its neighbors?
Because Israel is, in the end of the day, a settler colonial project, which means it's a European colonialist presence that became a state, and is a constant struggle with the indigenous native people of Palestine. It needs the Arab world to normalize that situation. What they're looking is for an Arab world that would regard whatever they have achieved so far as an inevitable part of the future. I mean, some of the Messianic Jews would go beyond that. But let's take the mainstream politics, the more commonsensical, if you want. And so that is true for the whole 76 years of the existence of Israel, or maybe even before that. So you need normal regional allies to normalize an abnormal reality, namely the idea that the Palestinians have to remove themselves in order that Europe can deal with its anti-Semitic problem. It's ridiculous, historically, morally, but that's what happened. That's what happened. Now, without that normalization, without that legitimization, Israel is very vulnerable. I don't think it's by itself a factor that can change the reality dramatically, because as I said to you before, I think you need to observe discrete processes that at one point in history become very powerful when they're fused together, but that's a very important process that is not happening and needs to happen. I mean, I always distinguish between what is already happening, all the things we talked about before, the indicators for change, and what has to happen, what hasn't happened. And that hasn't happened yet. Yes, it is very, very significant. Without that normalization, it is very difficult to continue with the situation as it is. Now, if you connect it to international isolation, at least by the civil society, the changes we talked about in the Jewish communities, you can understand that these are really powerful pressures and so on. But the problem in the Arab world is not different from the problem in Europe. The European civil society is not far behind, or maybe in the same place where most people in the Arab world are, namely total support for the Palestinian cause, absolutely willing to be part of the solidarity movement without any question, calling for boycott, calling for sanctions. Not much difference between what people who demonstrate in Morocco once a week to what people demonstrate in London. It's the same request from the governments and the same problem. So whether the political elite is in a Western democracy or the political elite is an authoritarian Arab country, both political elites refuse to heed what their own electorate wants on Palestine. So we need a total change in the essence of politics, which is so interesting. It has to be global. There are different regimes, undoubtedly, and yet not one of them we can point out to really and saying these are governments or rulers who really take seriously the moral concerns of their electorate when it comes to foreign policy, let's say, or bilateral connections or military connections, so on.
There's the big question, the elephant in the room. And I know it's a complicated question, and we could perhaps have multiple sessions on it, but I think everyone is asking the question, why? Why do the Arab regimes who you'd think would have an interest to placate their people, the desires of their people, the European regimes who are ostensibly meant to be responsive to public opinion, including the United States, which is slowly the population, the public opinion of Israel is moving towards being critical of the Zionist project and what the human cost to the Palestinians. Why, despite all these things, despite the international rules-based order, despite multiple UN condemnations of what Israel is doing, multiple breaches of international law that Israel has committed, why insist to support the state of Israel? It can be surely more than just, from the European perspective and the Western perspective, more than just it sits at a geostrategic trade route, surely. And with the Arab regimes, why risk uprisings, revolution? Jordan had a problem with this against themselves by insisting on doing the bidding or beyond the interests of what the people desperately want to see, which is the Palestinians, their rights and dignity respected.
Well, as you say, it deserves a very long answer, but I won't give it. I think it has to do with the essence of politics, and that's what I mean. It's surprisingly universal, despite the diversified realities of different political system. The essence of politics is that politicians nowadays, like never before, are A, very self-centered, B, are not strategic at all, and C, are only concerned about their political survival in the short term, not in the long term. So in the short term, Arab governments might look at the demonstrations and would say it's not so bad. The dividends we get by being allies of the United States, by getting security service or securitization services from Israel is, in the balance sheet, it's a risk worth taking. They really do not engage at all with a profound understanding of long-term processes. That's the difference, by the way, between a leader and a ruler. A ruler never looks beyond the day, beyond tomorrow. Will I survive tomorrow? Yes, that's fine. I think that's one problem. But also the self-centered, namely, it becomes such a profession, actually, rather than a calling. It's a profession. And as such, it has very practical and technical aspects to it, rather than what you would expect them to have, maybe moral ideas, profound historical understanding. And I think Israel builds on it very well, on this very short-term dividends of creating a sense that we can be of service to you, whether it's because you want to be close to the United States or whether you want to win the next election. We'll give you the money, we'll give you the support, or we will condemn your rivals as anti-Semites if you need us to do that. And remember the high-tech industry as well, which is very important. But I think that this kind of politics is being now challenged everywhere. And unfortunately, politicians would not easily accept that they have to change unless they will feel the pressure much more than a weekly demonstration or losing one election. So I think that in every place in the world where there is a success of challenging the essence of politics and injecting a little bit of morality into it, a little bit of real concerns of the people, not only on Palestine, on any issue, is a winning day for the Palestinian on their way to liberation. Any development that fails or doesn't allow such a development provides Israel another a year of immunity. But I think in the long term, it's going to change.
We have seen the Gazans go through what many, including many international bodies, have said looks and smells and quacks as a genocide. Right. We see the Gazans, despite this, holding many of them, the Muslims amongst them, because the 10% are Christian. Everyone seems to forget this in America, amongst the Christian Zionist lobby. Many of them, the Muslims amongst them, holding onto the Quran as a people of faith, taking refuge in their belief, in the hope for the future, in this world or the next, if their life if they don't hope to continue living despite this everything that's happened against them. Do we imagine they will abandon that Quran day one after a genocide? And if not, in a climate where many have designs for the region, for what Palestine should look like and for what the Middle East should look like, do the Palestinian people have a right to choose their own political destiny, including being guided by that same Quran that got them through such horrific atrocity?
Well, I would divide this in two. Of course, the Palestinians have the right to determine their destiny. And I think not only in Palestine, in the world at large, we will have to accept that we are living in what I would call a dialogical world. Namely, you will have a dialogue, a constant dialogue, between people who would definitely see the faith the religion, you call it the Quran, it doesn't matter, as the source of inspiration, the source of solace, the source that gives you resilience and resistance. But there would be others who would see it a bit differently. And they always, and I don't think there is a way of imposing one view on the other. So I think that you will have, and I know it from living in Palestine for more than 70 years, you have more than just one view about religion, about civilization, about the public space, and so on. What we need is just to get to the stage, which is a very positive stage, when we can discuss these issues and see how do we live with it. I can give you a very good example. I think anybody who is now in the Western perception is regarded as a secular Arab or whatever, Palestinians, do see themselves as part of Islamic civilization, not necessarily being Muslims in the way of life necessarily. That includes Christians and Jews, by the way, that see themselves as part of that civilization. So I think that should be that would be the future, actually, because any attempt to purify a society from ideas you don't like is a recipe for instability. I really am a great believer in this idea of an Indian philosopher called Mohanty, where you can agree about life and death. There are certain issues you can have a total consensus. Other things you may not have a consensus, but you can still live with one another, even if the agreement is not total on these issues. But definitely, and this is something maybe the West doesn't understand, what the West calls secularism is not the one that is fitting, I think, the Arab world and the Muslim world, and not only the Muslim world. There are also other religions in the world that are not Western. It's a way of life where you are going back to basic ideas that allow genuine coexistence, respected also different ways of life, but in a way that allowed the society to continue to live at peace with itself rather than igniting unnecessary disagreements and lack of unity.
I think a lot the reason behind the question I asked is the question that I think many Muslims are asking because they face a certain type of criticism, which is, or rather you could say in the public debate, especially in the West, many Zionists, and I attended a debate where my Zionist opponents used this, they said they didn't talk about the Palestinian rights. They talked about the fact that 90% of Palestinians are Muslim, and then they started to criticize, well, in essence say, why should we oblige their aspirations, considering that Islam, we don't like how it treats women, without being specific on anything. And I was very shocked by this approach, especially because I actually attended the debate not as a Muslim in a sense, but as simply I'm arguing a very specific motion about Palestinian rights. So I could be anyone, and I could have said the same thing. So when looking at a future for the region based somewhat on its own past, and of considering that it's a past where for over 1,000 years there was an understanding that the very fact you have old synagogues, the oldest churches in the world, in fact, mosques and many other buildings, communities who were never forced, converted into anything or had imposed upon them, in fact, having their own law systems, which I don't even think you have even in the West, where an enforceable, autonomous law system for their own community. How much do you think that they can be, that narrative can be allowed, and that narrative of going back to something in the past that worked can be can have its chance to speak against the demonization of the scaremongering against, well, this was a past of brutality, this is a past of persecution. when history shows that that's not the case. The Jews were prevented from going to Jerusalem by the Romans, and the ones who then opened up Jerusalem for Jews to come back is an Islamic caliphate, for example. Can people of the Middle East be allowed to call to a solution and not have it used against them as a means to deny them their aspirations?
Absolutely. It's up to the people of the Middle East, it's up to the people of the Arab world to decide exactly what they are basing the solution on, what inspires them, what models they aspire to. I think it's wrong to think that there's a homogeneous position here. I think there are different views about it. But first of all, you have to respect the authenticity of these views and the legitimacy of these views, but undoubtedly. And I think that much of the Islamophobia is based on ignorance, as we know. Much of the Islamophobia in the case of Palestine is based on the fact that the Zionist narrative that actually Palestine is not part of the Arab world has to do with it. Definitely any one of us who lived in a society like this understand that this is not just about the Middle East, it's also about Europe. It's also about other parts of the world. We will have to find the way of a genuine coexistence and the right of people to aspire to a certain way of life and respect that aspiration. But live and let live is not live and let the other die. It's the kind of thing, and actually I think, with this I will end, with all the criticism one should have against the Ottoman Empire, religion for the Ottoman Empire was a very flexible idea when it came to people who were not Muslims. They really were more tolerant, I think, than many people think they were on the idea that the Mosaic should be respected for over 400 years. And that mosaic is like many flowers, it's like multicultural. It's something that is benefiting humanity. It doesn't defeat humanity. But definitely, we should never forget that also secularism is an ideology. And therefore, humanity would have to work very hard, where dialogue is the way of life and not a means to defeat someone else's faith or point of view.
Professor Pappé, thank you for your insights, honesty, and candor.
Thank you so much.
Your work reminds us that the fight against injustice must be waged both in the archive and on the battlefield of ideas. I hope today's discussion inspires deeper reflection, sharper resistance, and greater courage. So thank you for joining us again. We'll see you all next time for another episode of the Narrative House podcast. Until then, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.